Suffolk, September 1815. The marriage had been arranged by the Dowager Countess of Stannard, which meant it had been arranged with the implacable certainty of a woman who had buried 2 husbands, outlived 3 political scandals, and considered sentiment a luxury reserved for people with fewer responsibilities. The Duke of Ashendon needed a wife whose presence would quiet the rumors that had followed him since Vienna. The Calvet family had a daughter of exceptional composure and unremarkable ambition, which was precisely the combination the Dowager had identified as useful. She had not consulted the daughter about whether she wished to be useful, nor had she consulted the Duke about whether composure was what he required, having decided some years earlier that what men required and what men requested were rarely the same thing, and that the former was her business. Severin Hale, the Duke of Ashendon, had agreed to the match in August, in a letter to his solicitor that contained 4 sentences and no adjectives. The Calvet fortune was modest, but clean. The Calvet name was old enough to carry weight in the counties that mattered, and quiet enough to carry no gossip in the drawing rooms that talked. The daughter, he had been informed, was intelligent without being conspicuous about it, handsome without being remarked upon for it, and capable of managing a household and a public reputation with the steady competence of a woman who had been doing both since her mother's death when she was 15. He had not asked what she looked like. He had not asked what she read or whether she laughed. He had asked whether she understood the terms, and the Dowager had assured him that she did. Rowena Calvet arrived at Ashendon Hall before dawn on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of September, because the Duke had specified the hour, and the Duke did not, according to the Dowager, adjust his schedule for other people's comfort. She was accompanied by her younger brother Tobias, and the settled attention of a woman who had spent 4 years managing a household, a family reputation, and a grief she had folded so neatly into competence that most people had forgotten it was there. Their father had died the previous winter, leaving debts that the Dowager did not know about, and Tobias did not fully understand, and that Rowena had been managing with quarterly precision since before the funeral. She wore dove gray, well-made, carefully chosen, the kind of dress that communicated reliability without inviting scrutiny. She had her mother's pearls at her throat and her late father's accounts in her head, and she sat in the morning room of Ashendon Hall in the gray light before sunrise and waited for the Duke to appear, and found the wallpaper oppressive and the tea excellent, and the silence the particular kind that belonged to houses where someone had decided what the rooms were for and had not invited the rooms to disagree. He appeared while the sky outside was still caught between night and morning. He was not what she had expected, though she had disciplined herself against expectation. He was younger than the voice of his letters had suggested, and there was something in the way he entered the room that told her he had rehearsed this, not the words, but the posture, the calibrated distance, the expression that said authority without saying anything beneath it. "Miss Calvet," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Her brother and the Dowager had positioned themselves near the window with the practiced transparency of people who believed proximity was the same as supervision. The Duke looked at this arrangement, and then at her, and said, with a brevity that did not pretend to be warmth, "I prefer to speak directly." "Shall we?" They were shown to his study. It was a careful room. The desk was ordered. The shelves were curated. The chair behind the desk was positioned to face the door. This was a man who arranged his surroundings the way he arranged his sentences, with nothing left to accident and nothing offered that had not been vetted first. She sat. He remained standing, which told her something about how he had categorized this conversation. "I will be direct," he said. "Please," she said. "I require a wife. The reasons are not sentimental. My position requires a public stability that I cannot demonstrate alone. There are matters of reputation that would benefit from the presence of a woman whose character is above question and whose temperament is suited to the demands of the role." He paused. He looked at the window behind her, rather than at her, I married once before, he said. The result was a public failure that I have spent 2 years managing and don't intend to repeat. He looked at her then, and his voice had the quality of a man delivering terms he had rehearsed until they no longer sounded like what they were. I would be marrying you for my reputation, Miss Calvert, not for love. I married my first wife for love, and I will not make that mistake again. He held her gaze. I am offering you a position, not a romance. I need you to understand that clearly, because I will not have ambiguity on this point later. Rowena looked at him across the study. She looked at the ordered desk, and the curated shelves, and the chair that faced the door, and the man who had just told her, with a precision he did not appear to recognize, the entire shape of his damage. She looked at the window he had looked at, instead of looking at her when he said the word, love, and she understood, with the quiet thoroughness she brought to everything that mattered, that the window had been easier. She thought about what it meant to be interviewed for the role of correction. She thought about a man who had loved once and had organized the wreckage into a policy and was now sitting across from a woman he had selected specifically because she was unlikely to make him feel anything. You loved her, she said. Something shifted behind his expression. The rehearsed authority faltered for exactly one breath. That is not relevant to the arrangement, he said. It is the only relevant thing, she said. But it is yours to carry, not mine to manage. She stood. The movement was unhurried, which was deliberate. Everything she did in this room was going to be deliberate, because she understood that this man cataloged behavior the way she cataloged rooms, and the record she left needed to be precise. Thank you for your candor, your grace, she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected agreement or negotiation and had received neither. She did not curtsy. She did not incline her head. She looked at him for one full moment with an expression that gave him exactly what he had asked for. Clarity without ambiguity. And then she turned and walked out of the study with the unhurried pace of a woman who was not leaving because she had been dismissed, but because she had heard enough. She collected Tobias from the morning room with a single glance that her brother, who had spent 22 years interpreting her single glances, understood completely. They were in the carriage before the Dowager had reached the entrance hall, and through the Ashendon gates before anyone in the house had fully registered that the interview had concluded, and that the conclusion had not been the one the Duke had prepared for. The first light of sunrise was just reaching the Suffolk fields as the carriage pulled away, and Rowena watched it spread across the flat landscape with the composed attention of a woman who was finished with a room and was not going to look back at it longer than the architecture deserved. Tobias said nothing until they had cleared the Ashendon gates and turned onto the county road, which was the correct instinct of a younger brother who had been raised by his sister rather than merely alongside her. Well, he said. He does not want a wife, she said. He wants a wall. Something between himself and whatever happened in Vienna. Something presentable and quiet and willing to stand where it is placed. She looked at the road ahead. I am not a wall, Tobias. Her brother was quiet for a moment. He is a duke, Ro. The Dowager says the situation with the first Duchess was. I know what it was, she said. I know what Lady Ashendon did in Vienna, and I know what it cost him publicly, and I understand entirely why he has decided that his next marriage should be a transaction rather than a risk. She paused. I will not be the safe choice a frightened man makes to prove he has recovered. Tobias looked at her with the expression of a man who knew his sister well enough to recognize when she was arriving at something rather than retreating from it. What will you do? He said. She was quiet for a moment, watching the Suffolk countryside pass in the early morning light, the flat fields and the wide sky, and the quality of late summer that had not quite decided to become autumn. There is a property, she said. Briarfield House, the estate east of Ashendon. The widow who owns it has been looking for a buyer since the spring. Sound land, Well-positioned, excellent soil, and the house has a library with southern light. Tobias looked at her. It borders Ashendon land, he said. It is an excellent property, she said. The location is convenient. Rowe. It is a business decision, Tobias. Our situation requires income, and land in Suffolk at this price will not remain available. He looked at her with the expression of a younger brother who had been interpreting his sister's business decisions for 22 years and had a comprehensive understanding of what they looked like when they were purely business and what they looked like when they were something else entirely. He said nothing further. She looked out the window at the Suffolk sky and thought about a study with a desk that faced the door and a man who had said the word, love, while looking at a window, and meant it as a warning. And she told herself that Briarfield was entirely about the soil and the income and the library with southern light, and she almost believed it for the length of the drive home. Briarfield House was purchased in October, which was faster than most property transactions in Suffolk, because Rowena Calvert had her late father's solicitors and her own arithmetic, and the focused determination of a woman who had decided something and considered delay a form of dishonesty. The Duke of Ashendon was informed of his new neighbor by the Dowager, who mentioned it during a Tuesday afternoon call with the careful casualness of a woman delivering information she considered significant while pretending to consider it incidental. Miss Calvert, the Duke said. He set down his correspondence. The Calvert daughter. The same, the Dowager said. Briarfield House. The sale completed last week. She will take possession before the month is out. The Duke looked at the window that faced east, toward the tree line where Ashendon land met the old Briarfield boundary, where the elms stood in their October color, and the tenant meadow ran flat and open for a quarter mile. Before the month is out, he said. She has engaged a land agent from Ipswich, the Dowager said, and a builder. The east wing roof requires attention, apparently. The Duke said nothing for a moment. He picked up his correspondence again, read nothing on it, and set it down a second time. The Briarfield water rights, he said. The eastern stream. That matter was never formally settled with the previous owner. It was not, the Dowager agreed. Have my steward review the records, he said, before she arrives. The Dowager noted this and said nothing further, and the Tuesday call continued, but the Duke looked at the east window once more before she left, and the Dowager, who had been reading the directions of attention for 40 years, noted that as well. She was at Briarfield by the last week of October, which surprised the county. October was not the time one took possession of a Suffolk estate. October was for London, for the closing weeks of the social season, for the careful rounds of calls and correspondence that maintained a family's position through the winter. October in the country was for people whose positions were so established they required no maintenance, or for people who had decided that maintenance was not their priority. Rowena arrived on a Thursday with 2 wagons of household goods, a housekeeper she had brought from the Calvert house in Norwich, a land agent whose specialty was water rights and soil drainage, and her brother Tobias, who had come for the week to help her settle, and who understood without being told that the settling was not the part she needed help with. The county noticed all of this. Suffolk was a county that noticed things, being prosperous enough and established enough and close enough to the London road that there was always someone paying attention to the interesting, and a young unmarried woman of modest fortune, taking solitary possession of a country estate in late October, was by any measure interesting. She spent the first week learning the house. She walked every room, every outbuilding, every acre of the grounds in the October chill, with the methodical attention of a woman taking inventory of something she intended to understand completely before she changed any part of it. The estate was sound, but tired. The previous owner had let the east meadow go fallow, and the orchard needed pruning that should have been done 2 seasons earlier, and the stream that ran along the northern boundary, the stream whose water rights had never been formally settled, was silting where it entered the Briarfield land from the Ashendon side. She noted all of it. She had a plan drawn up by Saturday. On Monday morning, she put on her walking boots and went to look at the boundary. The elms stood along the western edge of the property, tall and unhurried in their autumn shedding, and beyond them was Ashendon land, the same flat Suffolk landscape, a tenant farm visible in the middle distance, the Ashendon chimneys just showing above the tree line on the horizon. She stood at the boundary and looked at both sides and thought about water rights and precedent and the way a county with long memory kept its accounts. She heard him before she saw him. He came from the Ashendon side on a bay, at a pace that said he had known where she was and had come deliberately. And she thought about that. The deliberateness, and what it meant that a man who valued control had chosen to ride to a boundary line on a Monday morning when he could have sent his steward. He pulled up at the tree line and looked at her across the boundary with the expression she recognized from the study. The efficient attention, the one that preceded a position he had already formed. "Miss Calvert," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She did not curtsy. They were standing in a field in October. The courtesies were for studies and drawing rooms. He looked at her, and then at the elms, and then back at her. "I see you have wasted no time," he said. "I have wasted no time," she agreed. The estate required attention. "The water rights," he said. "My steward tells me you have engaged a land agent." "I have. The eastern stream is silting where it crosses the boundary. The flow has been redirected at some point, and the original course is no longer clear. My steward has been reviewing the Ashendon records on the same matter," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The October wind moved through the elm branches above them, and a handful of leaves came down between them with the unhurried indifference of things that had been falling in this place long before either of them had arrived. "Then we shall both have records," she said, "and they will either agree, in which case the matter is simple, or they will not, in which case the matter becomes a negotiation." He regarded her for a moment with an expression she had not seen in the study. Not the efficient attention, something less rehearsed than that. Something that had arrived without his permission. "You are very direct," he said. "You told me you preferred directness," she said, "in the study. I took you at your word." The bay shifted beneath him. He steadied it with a hand that knew what it was doing, and looked at her across the boundary with the expression that was moving, incrementally, away from the rehearsed one, and towards something she was going to have to think about later. "The stream," he said. "The silting affects the Ashendon tenant meadow as well as your land. Any remediation will require access across both properties." "I am aware," she said. "I intended to write to your steward about it." "Write to me," he said. She looked at him. "The water rights concern us both," he said. "Write to me directly." He turned to the horse. "Good morning, Miss Calvert." "Good morning, Your Grace," she said to his retreating back, and stood at the boundary for a moment after he had gone in the October cold, and thought about the word directly, and about the expression that had arrived without his permission, and then went back to Briarfield, and did not think about either of them for the rest of the day, with moderate success. The records were reviewed, compared, and returned with the results she had expected, which was to say, with results that confirmed her legal position and complicated his historical one in the precise way that made further conversation necessary. The eastern stream, according to the 1791 deed under which Briarfield had last changed hands, followed a course that ran 14 feet inside the Ashendon boundary before turning south onto Briarfield land. The same stream, according to the Ashendon estate maps dating to 1746, had always run entirely on Ashendon property until it reached a stone culvert at the boundary, where it crossed onto Briarfield land by established right of drainage. The culvert had collapsed sometime in the 1780s. Someone had redirected the stream around it. And for 30 years, neither estate had noticed or cared, because the previous Briarfield owners had been content to receive whatever water arrived by whatever course it chose, and the Ashendon family had been dukes, with no particular experience of anyone questioning the path of their water. Rowena read both sets of records at the writing desk in the Briarfield library on a Thursday morning, in the southern light she had mentioned to Tobias, and which was, she had confirmed in 3 weeks of occupation, as good as she had hoped, and thought about the 14 feet of disputed streambed, which contained a collapsed culvert, a silting problem, and the pleasure of a disagreement that was both legally interesting and practically urgent. She wrote to the Duke. The letter took 2 drafts. The first was too warm. The second was precisely correct, factual, specific, ending with a proposal for a meeting to review the documents together, which was the reasonable next step, and also the step that would put her in a room with him again, which she wasn't going to examine too closely. She sent the second draft. His reply came the following morning, which was faster than she had expected, in a hand she recognized as his own, rather than a secretary's. Miss Calvert, I have reviewed both records. The discrepancy is clear. I propose Thursday next, 10 in the morning, at the Boundary. Bring the 1791 deed. I will bring the Ashendon maps. Ashendon. She read this note twice. She noted that he had written it himself. She noted the absence of pleasantries, no social padding, no performative regret about the situation, just the time and the documents and the expectation of her presence. She found this, against her better judgment, more appealing than elaborate courtesy would have been. She sent back a reply of equal economy. Thursday next, 10 in the morning. I will bring the deed. R. Calvert. Thursday was cold and sharp in the way of Suffolk in late October, the kind of morning where the air had an edge, and the light was flat and honest, and there was nowhere to be imprecise. She arrived at the Boundary at 5 minutes to 10. He was already there. He was on foot this time, which she noted, the Ashendon maps in his hand, and he had brought his steward, which told her something about how he had categorized this meeting. She had brought her land agent, which told him something back. They spread the documents on the flat top of the Boundary wall, her 1791 deed, his 1746 maps, and stood on opposite sides of the wall and read each other's evidence with the focused attention of 2 people who were both entirely right and entirely incompatible. The Ashendon maps predate the deed by 45 years, he said. The deed is the operative legal document, she said. Precedent carries weight in this county, he said. Precedent and legal title are different things, she said, and I find the distinction worth preserving. He looked at her across the Boundary wall with the expression that had been shifting in their 2 encounters, incrementally away from the efficient one and toward something that occupied more of his face and required more effort to manage. You have done this before, he said. Argued a property dispute. Argued, he said, with something in the word that was not an accusation. My late father's affairs involved a considerable number of negotiations, she said. I have managed most of them since I was 19. Your father involved you in his business affairs. My father had debts, she said, with a directness that surprised both of them. He had me. He decided when I was 15 that these 2 facts were either a catastrophe or a resource, and proceeded on the assumption of the latter. She met his gaze. He was not wrong. The Duke considered her for a moment. He looked at the documents. He looked at the collapsed culvert visible in the streambed, where the water had been finding its own way for 30 years, with the patient indifference of water that did not care who owned it. The stream, he said, pointing to the map. If the culvert is rebuilt on the original line, the silting resolves itself. The flow returns to the established course, which runs 14 feet inside your boundary, she said, before crossing onto mine. If the original course is restored, the maintenance of those 14 feet falls to you. The maintenance has been neglected by Ashendon for 30 years, he said. Then Ashendon has been neglecting a stream on Ashendon land, she said, and I am merely drawing attention to the fact. The steward to his left appeared to be studying the middle distance with considerable focus. Miss Calvert, the Duke said, and his voice had dropped below the formal register into something more direct. I am going to make you a proposal. She waited. The culvert, he said, It requires rebuilding regardless of whose boundary it sits on. I propose we agree to a joint restoration, costs shared equally, the original watercourse restored, and the boundary formally recorded as the deed describes it, not as the Ashendon maps suggest." He paused, which resolves the legal question and the practical one simultaneously. She looked at him. "You are conceding the boundary," she said. "I am recognizing the deed," he said. "You have 45 years of precedent," she said. "You could contest this through the county courts, and likely prevail on historical grounds alone." "I could," he said. "Why don't you?" He looked at the stream. "Because it would take a year, and cost both estates considerably. And at the end of it, one of us would have 14 feet of streambed, and the other would have a grievance, and we are going to be neighbors for the foreseeable future." He looked back at her. "I prefer functional neighbors to legal victories." She looked at the documents. She looked at the boundary wall between them. She thought about the proposal, which was fair and practical, and the kind of thing a man offered when he had decided he respected the other party enough to settle, rather than win. "I accept," she said, "on the condition that the formal record reflects the deed boundary, not the historical one." He was quiet for a moment. Agreed. She extended her hand across the boundary wall. He took it, the hand of a woman who managed her own estate in a glove that was well made and slightly worn at the right thumb, where the pen rested, and shook it with the brief, firm grip of a man who meant what he agreed to. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. "Good morning, Miss Calvert." She walked back to Briarfield with her land agent and the 1791 deed, and the satisfaction of a woman who had held her ground and been met with something she had not expected. The county dinners began in November. Suffolk society in autumn was a closed instrument. The same families, the same houses, the same conversations rotating through the same rooms, with the practiced ease of people who had been performing this particular music for generations and had no interest in changing the key. Rowena had been received with the cautious warmth of a county that was not yet certain what to make of her. She was respectable enough to be included. She was not titled enough to be deferred to. She was, several people had noted independently, very good at conversation, which in Suffolk society was either a credential or an inconvenience, depending on whose conversation she was outperforming. She and the Duke were at the same dinner 3 times in November. The first was at Dryford Hall, where they exchanged one remark about the culvert restoration, which was overheard by Mrs. Pemberton, and by Thursday had become the most discussed topic in the county. The second was at the Dowager's house, where she had seated them across from each other at a distance she had been calculating for 40 years, close enough for conversation, far enough for propriety. The third was at Ashendon Hall itself, where Rowena sat 3 places from the Duke and talked to Mr. Fenton about water law for 30 minutes, because the culvert was still giving her trouble on the southern section. She was aware during the conversation that the Duke was listening. Not visibly, he was managing his end of the table with the discipline of a host who had been doing this since he was 22. But she had developed over the 3 dinners a working understanding of where his attention was, and it was, with a frequency she noted and did not examine, directed toward her. At the end of the Ashendon dinner, in the entrance hall, the Dowager appeared at her elbow, with the practiced materialization of a woman who had been waiting for her moment. "You handled Mr. Fenton beautifully," the Dowager said. "Mr. Fenton knows a great deal about water law," Rowena said. "Mr. Fenton knows a great deal about water law, and very little about anything that occurs above ground level," the Dowager said, "which makes him useful at dinner and entirely beside the point at every other occasion." She looked across the hall at her nephew. "He watches you," the Dowager said. "He does not know he is doing it, which is how I know it is real." Rowena looked at her gloves. "I am aware of the history," she said carefully. "The history," the Dowager said, "is a wound that he has dressed as a policy. He has been managing it so long he has forgotten it is a wound at all." She paused. "Policies are revised, Miss Calvert, when the evidence is sufficient." "I purchased Briarfield as a business investment," Rowena said. "Of course you did," the Dowager said with the serenity of a woman who had been told the same thing 3 times and had formed her own conclusions. "Good evening, Miss Calvert." December brought the hard frost that Suffolk occasionally produced. Ice in the rebuilt channel, water backing up into the East Meadow, the precise situation she had been trying to prevent. She wrote to the Duke on a Monday morning. He arrived at Briarfield on Tuesday afternoon. She had expected a letter. Instead, he was shown into the library, where she was reviewing drainage plans with her land agent, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room, the desk covered in maps, the southern light falling across her work before he spoke. "I thought a look at the stream would be more useful than a letter," he said. "It would," she said. She dismissed the land agent and took the Duke out to the East Meadow in the December cold with the drainage plans under her arm. They walked the length of the channel in the frost. She showed him where the ice had backed the water, and he listened with the complete attention she had come to expect from him, and asked 2 questions that confirmed he understood the problem, and one that suggested he already knew the answer. If the inlet were widened here, he said, pointing to the survey map, the flow would clear the ice before it accumulated. "That was my land agent's conclusion," she said. "The work requires access across the Ashendon Meadow." "You have it," he said. "I will speak to my steward today." "You came yourself," she said. "You could have sent the steward. Or written." He held her gaze. "I told you to write to me directly," he said. "That implies the same in return." She thought about a man who had told her he was marrying for reputation and not for love, and had come personally to stand in her frozen meadow in December, and had said, "You have it," without making her ask twice. "Thank you," she said. "It is a practical matter," he said. "The stream affects both properties." "Yes," she said. "It is entirely practical." He looked at her with the expression that was never entirely the efficient one anymore, the one that lived in the space between what he had decided and what the evidence was showing him. They walked back to the house. She offered tea. He accepted, the first time he had accepted anything at Briarfield, and they sat in the library for 40 minutes and talked about drainage, and then about the county roads, and then about a book on agricultural reform she had on the shelf that he had also read, and neither of them mentioned the study or the interview, or the morning she had walked out before sunrise, and the afternoon was entirely practical and entirely not. The spring assembly at Dryford Hall was the first large gathering of the season. 40 people, the full county, the opening event of a social calendar that would run through to midsummer. Rowena arrived with the Dowager, who had developed the habit of arriving with her at these occasions, without either of them having formally arranged it, which was the Dowager's way of making alliances official without the inconvenience of discussion. The Duke was there. He was across the room when she arrived, in conversation with Mr. Fenton and 2 landowners she recognized from the November dinners, and he looked up when she entered with the attention she had learned to identify and had stopped pretending not to notice. The evening proceeded as these evenings did, the circuits of the room, the conversations that overlapped and separated, the careful choreography of 40 people managing their positions in a public space. She talked about the spring planting with the Dryford family. She talked about London with 2 young women who were going up in April and were vibrating with anticipation. She talked about the county road bill with Mr. Fenton, who had strong opinions, and then the Duke appeared at Mr. Fenton's shoulder at some point during the discussion and stayed, and the 3 of them talked about roads until Mr. Fenton was called away by his wife, and then it was the 2 of them, and the conversation moved without either of them directing it from roads to the stream, to the spring planting at Briarfield, to a question he asked about the Norwich house she had grown up in. That was the first question he had ever asked her about herself, rather than about the land. She answered it. He listened. He asked a second question. She thought, this is what it looks like when he is actually curious. She thought I should not be keeping notes on what he looks like when he is actually curious. Sir Marden Foss arrived at her left shoulder. She had seen him circling for 20 minutes and had noted it with the attention she brought to rooms and had placed it within the normal range of a social evening. She was wrong about the normal range. "Miss Calvert," Sir Martin said, with the tone of a man about to be charming in a way that required witnesses. There were 5 people within easy hearing. He had chosen his moment. "Briarfield is looking well, I hear. Considerable activity for a property of that size." "Thank you," she said. "The stream required attention." "The stream," Sir Martin said, with a smile at the people within hearing. "Quite. One does wonder." He paused with the theatrical timing of a man who had been making these pauses for 30 years, whether the investment is proportionate to the establishment. "That is to say," he continued, "Suffolk has a certain character, an order to things. One hopes that new arrivals appreciate the character of the county before embarking on improvements that may exceed their tenure." The word improvements did the work he had designed it to do. In a neutral mouth, it was a compliment. In his mouth, with his pause and his audience and his careful smile, it meant you are modest money in established Suffolk, and you have overreached yourself, and everyone in this room understands it. She held his gaze with the composure of a woman who had been managing rooms since she was 16, and had heard this particular variety of condescension in Norwich, counting houses, and London solicitors' offices, and had developed a comprehensive response to it. She was formulating that response when she heard the Duke's voice. "The improvements at Briarfield," the Duke said from her right, in a voice she had not heard before. Not the study voice, not the boundary voice, not the dinner voice. The one underneath all of them. The one that had 200 years of Suffolk in it and knew exactly what weight it carried. "Include a stream restoration that has resolved a drainage problem affecting both the Briarfield and Ashenden properties for 30 years. He looked at Sir Martin with the complete attention that had been directed at her in the study, and was now directed at someone else entirely. The investment is entirely proportionate, as anyone familiar with the Briarfield land would know. Sir Martin's smile underwent a rapid recalibration. "Of course, I merely—" "The county," the Duke said, with the economy of a man who did not require volume, benefits from landowners who take their property seriously. I think we are all agreed on that." He looked at Sir Martin for one moment, longer than was necessary, which was the ducal equivalent of a direct statement, and then returned to the conversation as though nothing had occurred, and Sir Martin found someone else to talk to with the haste of a man who had been corrected in public and required time to recover his position. Rowena stood beside the Duke in the aftermath of this and thought about what had just happened. She thought about it with the precision she brought to important information, the weight of what he had said and how he had said it, and the fact that he had said it at all. He did not look at her. He was talking to the 2 landowners from before, talking about the road bill, and nothing in his manner indicated that he had just done something significant. She thought he knows he has. She thought he is waiting to see what I do with it. She excused herself from the group and crossed to the far side of the room and stood with the Dowager, who looked at her expression, and then at the Duke across the room, and then back at her expression. "Well," the Dowager said. "He intervened," Rowena said. "I saw. He did not have to." "No," the Dowager said. "He did not." She accepted a glass of wine from a passing footman with the serenity of a woman who had been anticipating this conversation for some time. "Sir Martin will be careful for the rest of the season, which is a useful outcome for everyone." Rowena looked across the room at the Duke, who was still in conversation, and was not looking at her. "He said the improvements affected Ashenden," she said. "He made it about the land." "He made it about the land," the Dowager agreed, so that Sir Martin had no graceful way to continue, so that the room understood his position without requiring him to make a declaration, and so that you were defended without being diminished. She paused, which is a very particular kind of intelligence. Rowena held her glass and thought about the months since September, the water disputes and drainage channels, and December afternoons in the library, and a man who had told her he was marrying for reputation, and not for love, and had spent every month since discovering that she was considerably more than a reputation exercise. "He was wrong about me," she said. "In the study." "Yes," the Dowager said, "and he knows it. He has known it for some time." She looked at Rowena steadily. "He is a man who does his accounting carefully. He required sufficient evidence." Rowena thought about the study in September, the man who had looked at the window instead of at her when he said the word love. She thought about the version of herself who had walked out before sunrise, and the version of herself who was standing in this room half a year later with a wine glass and a drainage plan and a county that was beginning to understand what she was. She looked across the room at the Duke. He looked back. Not the efficient attention, the other one. The one she had stopped pretending not to notice. She held his gaze for one moment, one beat longer than the social register required, and then turned back to the Dowager and said something about the road bill, and the assembly continued around them, and neither of them said anything further that evening, and it cost them both considerably. He called at Briarfield on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the assembly, which was fast enough to mean it had been decided before the assembly was over. She was in the East Meadow when he arrived. The stream was running clean after the winter restoration, and she was checking the channel banks with her land agent, which was not the condition in which she would have chosen to receive a Duke, but she had stopped arranging herself for his benefit sometime in December and was not going to resume the practice. She saw him from across the meadow. He was at the Briarfield gate on foot, and he waited there while she completed her conversation with the land agent and walked back across the field toward him. She did not hurry. He did not appear to expect her to. "Your Grace," she said when she reached the gate. "Miss Calvert." He looked at the East Meadow, at the stream running clean and clear in the March morning. "It is working," he said. "It is working," she confirmed. "The Ashendon Meadow has been dry this past week for the first time in 2 winters," he said. "Your land agent's redesign solved both problems." "I am glad," she said. He looked at the gate between them, which she had not opened. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "In the study," he said. "In September." "What I said, the manner in which I said it." He paused. "It was not how I should have spoken to you." He was looking at the gatepost rather than at her, which was the only indication that this was costing him something. "I came to that interview with a position formed before I entered the room," he said. "A position that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with." He stopped. "Your first wife," she said. "I understood in the study," she said. "That is why I left. Not because you insulted me, though you did, but because I understood that you were not seeing me at all. You were managing a wound." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I am not Lady Ashendon," she said. "I am not a correction for Lady Ashendon. I am not a safer version of whatever she was." "I know," he said. "I have known it since November." He looked at the East Meadow, at the stream finding its way through the channel she had designed and he had helped build. "You are not a safer version of anything," he said. "You are," he paused, and the pause had nothing rehearsed in it, and nothing managed. "You are the most inconvenient person I have encountered in the entirety of my adult life. And I mean that as a complete accounting of my situation." She thought about a man who had walked into a study with a wound dressed as a policy and had spent 6 months having the policy dismantled by water rights and boundary walls, and a woman who knew what her position was and had purchased it at market value. "You defended me at the assembly," she said. He met her eyes. "Sir Marden was," he began. "You defended me," she said, before Sir Marden finished his sentence. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because he was wrong," he said. "And I was the person in that room most qualified to say so and the most obligated to." He paused. "And because," he stopped again. He looked at the gatepost. He looked back at her. "Because you had already made the case better than I could," he said. "I wanted it on record." She thought about the study in September and the morning she had walked out before sunrise, and about what she was going to do now in this moment, at this gate, with this man who had stood in an assembly and said anyone familiar with the Briarfield land would know and had come through a March morning to apologize without qualification. She opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "The East Meadow is worth seeing properly, and I believe I owe you tea, given how many times you have provided it." He came through the gate. He fell into step beside her on the path toward the house. The March morning was clear, and the meadow was running clean, and the county of Suffolk went about its business around them, and nothing had been said that resolved anything, and everything had been said that needed saying first. The tea was in the Briarfield library. She had chosen the library because it was where she worked, and because she was not going to arrange a drawing room for him as though this were a morning call. It wasn't a morning call. It was a man who had come through a gate she had opened, and who had said, because you had already made the case, and who was now sitting in the chair across her desk with an expression that had nothing managed in it at all. Mrs. Garrett brought the tea and left with the practiced invisibility of a good housekeeper, and Rowena poured and handed him his cup, and sat back in her chair and looked at him across the desk. He looked at the books. He looked at the desk, covered in estate papers and survey maps, and a letter from a creditor in Norwich that she had been answering that morning. He took in all of it with the attention of a man reading a room. "You work here," he said. "Every morning." "The drawing room is for visitors," she said. "The library is for work." She paused. "You are not a visitor." He set the cup down. "In my experience, women who have libraries they work in are either eccentric or formidable. And which category have you assigned me?" "I have been revising the categories," he said, "since approximately November." She thought about the apology at the gate, the one that had not deflected into explanation, the one that had named what he had done, and stopped there. She had spent 6 months trying to dislike him with consistency, and the apology had been the final evidence that consistency on this point was no longer available to her. "I want to say something," she said, "about the interview." He waited. "I understood what you were doing," she said. "In the study. I understood it the moment you said it, that you were not describing me. You were describing what you needed after what you had been through." She met his gaze. "I did not leave because I was insulted. I left because staying would have required you to defend a position you held for reasons neither of us were ready to discuss." She paused. Walking out was the only honest exit. He was quiet for a moment. "It was the most precise thing anyone has ever done in my presence," he said. "I thought about it for a week. What did you conclude?" "That I had managed the interview very badly," he said, "and that you had managed it exceptionally well." He held her gaze. "And that the woman who walked out of that study before sunrise was not a woman who knew her place, in the sense I had meant it. She was a woman who knew her position in a way that meant something entirely different, something about clarity and self-possession, and the decision to leave a room before it became something neither of us could take back. It was not the quality I had advertised for." "No," she said. "It was a better one." "Severin," she said. He stilled. She had not used his name before. She had used his title, and your grace, and the space where his name would go. And now the name itself was in the Briarfield library, and neither of them could put it back. "Yes," he said. "I bought this estate because of you," she said. "Not entirely. The property is sound, and the investment was rational. But I bought it, knowing it was next to yours. And I told myself it was business. And I almost believed it for about 3 weeks." She looked at the survey maps. "I was angry," she said. "And I wanted you to see me. Not the composure and the modest fortune. Not the category I had been assigned. I thought that if I were your neighbor, you would have to see me eventually. That was not a mature strategy," she said. "It was an effective one," he said. "It resulted in you being here in this library having this conversation." He paused. "I consider the investment sound." He stood and came around the desk, and she stood, because this was not a conversation for sitting, and they were very close in the Briarfield Library, with the March morning light coming through the southern windows and the survey maps between them, and 6 months of boundary disputes behind them. "I was wrong about you," he said, "in the study in September. I was wrong before I met you, and I was wrong in the meeting, and I am asking." He stopped. He looked at her with the expression that had nothing of management in it. "I am asking whether I am too late to be right." She did not walk out. She put her hand on his arm, flat and deliberate, and looked up at him and said, "You are not too late." He covered her hand with his. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It had the honesty of a man who had been revising his position for 6 months. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to accounts and drainage plans and every true thing she had ever decided. And the library was warm, and the survey maps were still on the desk, and none of it required any further management. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm. "The boundary agreement," she said. "Is settled," he said. "The stream is working. The east meadow is dry. Are we conducting a full estate review?" "I am establishing," she said, "that the practical matters are in order before addressing the impractical ones." "You are going to be very difficult to be married to," he said. "Is that a proposal?" "It is a preliminary assessment," he said, "preceding a proposal. My preliminary assessment is that you are going to find it considerably harder to maintain a policy around someone who lives next door and has read all the same books. I have noticed," he said, "that my policies have been performing very badly in this neighborhood. They have been performing terribly," she said. "I would recommend a wholesale revision." He took her hand and held it. "Rowena," her name in his voice. "Severin," she said back, and this time it meant everything she had not said since September. April in Suffolk was the county at its best, the gardens stirring, the social calendar filling with the energy of a county emerging from winter and finding itself entirely unchanged, and quietly delighted about it. They were engaged by the 2nd week of April. He had asked formally in the Briarfield Library on a Wednesday morning with the directness she had come to trust. She had said yes with the same directness, and they had shaken hands about it, before either of them registered the absurdity of shaking hands upon an engagement. And then he had looked at their joined hands, and she had laughed, small and real and unmanaged, and he received it with the expression she now knew was his version of complete happiness. Tobias received the news from behind the agricultural journal he had been reading when she told him. "The Duke of Ashendon," he said, "the man who told you he was marrying you for his reputation and not for love. He has revised that position considerably. He came through my gate and apologized without qualification," she said, "and then he sat in my library and said that walking out before sunrise was the most precise thing he had encountered in a decade." She paused. "I find I cannot hold a man's September against him when his March is everything it should be." "Is he good enough for you?" Tobias said. "He's trying to be," she said. "That is the best version of the answer." The Duke's reply to Tobias's letter arrived the following morning, addressed to Rowena. It said, "Your brother's letter was honest and entirely beside the point. I am marrying you. The accounts will follow. S." She put it in the desk drawer where she kept his letters. There were 9. The Dowager called on Tuesday with the energy of a woman who had exercised restraint for 3 days, which was the maximum available to her. "He was happy when he called on me yesterday," the Dowager said. "I have not seen him happy in 3 years. He showed it the way he shows everything, very quietly and without announcement. But it was there." She looked at Rowena. "You are good for him." "He is good for me," Rowena said, "which is the thing I did not expect." "What did you expect?" "I expected to prove a point," she said. "I expected to be right." She paused. "I did not expect to discover that he was also right about certain things, and that the things he was right about were the things that made him worth the argument. What was he right about?" That a woman who knows her position, Rowena said, is a formidable thing. He had entirely the wrong definition of the word. But the instinct wasn't wrong. The dowager paused at the library door. The engagement dinner. First week of May. The full county. Sir Martin will be invited. Rowena looked at her. Because, the dowager said, the sight of Sir Martin congratulating you on your engagement to the Duke of Ashendon will be one of the most satisfying things I have witnessed in recent memory, and I am not above enjoying it. I find I am not above it either, Rowena said. They were married in June, at the church between the two estates. She wore dove gray. No one was surprised. The village turned out. Suffolk turned out. Because the marriage of this duke to this woman was an occasion with the quality of a story the county had been following since September. Rowena walked in on her brother's arm and looked at Severin at the front of the church and thought about the study and the man who had told her he was marrying her for his reputation, and the morning she had walked out before sunrise. She thought about all the versions of the walk out. The first, in September. I see you. I hear you. I am leaving before this room becomes something we cannot undo. The second, at the spring assembly, when she had found his gaze across the room and held it one beat longer than required, and then turned away. I see what you did. I have not decided what it means. The third, in the library, when she had stood from her chair and not walked out. The deliberate absence of leaving. I am not performing an exit for you anymore. I am staying. She reached the front of the church. Severin looked at her with the full unmanaged attention. Nothing of September in it. Nothing of the study. Nothing of the man who had organized his grief into a policy. Just him, entirely present, looking at the woman who had bought the estate next door and argued the water rights and fixed the stream and been right about everything and had chosen him anyway. She did not walk away. She took his hand. He held it with the brief, firm grip of a man who meant what he agreed to, and then he did not let go. He found her in the East Garden, as the June evening stretched across Suffolk, in the long, golden way of evenings that did not want to end. She was looking at the rose beds with the focused expression of a woman already redesigning something. The roses are in the wrong beds, she said. The roses, he said, are yours. All of it. The East Garden and the meadow and the boundary and the stream. All of it is yours in every sense that matters. She looked at the roses and thought about knowing her place and what it had meant in September and what it meant in June, and how completely a single phrase could turn itself inside out over 9 months with the right evidence. She stepped toward him. He met her in the middle of the garden, between the rose beds and the long light, and the 2 sets of chimneys visible in opposite directions. 2 estates on either side of a boundary they had settled, and were now in every sense beyond. I married you for my reputation, he said quietly. I know, she said. I was wrong about what I needed. You were wrong about what the word meant, she said. You thought reputation was what other people saw. It is not. It is what you are when no one is performing. And what am I? He said. She put her hand on his chest. You are the man who came through my gate, she said. That is your reputation now. The June evening went on around them, warm and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to whether any of it had been practical. And the answer they had both arrived at was that it had been, just not in the way either of them had told themselves in September. The best decisions, her mother had always said, were the ones you understood better after you had made them than before. Rowena understood this one completely.